There are weapons that history remembers, and there are weapons that history is embarrassed to remember. The M3 submachine gun falls into a strange third category, a weapon that history almost forgot entirely, dismissed by the men who carried it, scorned by critics who call it stamped metal garbage, designed by its own creators to be thrown away like a candy wrapper once it stopped working. $20. That's what it cost the United States government to put one in a soldier's hands in 1943. $20 for an object made mostly from sheet metal pressed into shapes, held together with spot welds, equipped with sights that were optimistic at best and a safety mechanism that was nothing more than a hinged flap of steel over the ejection port. And yet, there were German soldiers in the winter of 1944 who would hear a very particular sound in the dark, a slow, methodical, almost lazy rattle of automatic fire, a sound utterly unlike the familiar staccato bark of American Thompsons or the electric buzz of their own MP40S, and feel something they had been trained never to feel. Not respect, not tactical analysis. Fear, a cold, specific, personal fear of the kind that doesn't come from doctrine or battlefield statistics, but from experience. From watching what a 230-grain bullet traveling at 920 feet per second does to a human body at 30 meters. From understanding too late that the ugly little machine in the Americans' hands was doing something their own weapons were not. This is a story of why. Unteroffizier Klaus Hoffmann was 22 years old and had survived North Africa, Italy, and the first weeks of the Normandy fighting, which many was, by the late autumn of 1944, something close to a ghost. Most men who had seen what he had seen were already in the ground. He was in Belgium now, near a town whose name he couldn't pronounce, dug into the frozen earth with 6 other men from what had once been a full platoon. The Ardennes, the forest that was supposed to slow the Americans down. The trees were bare and bone-white in the December cold, and the darkness between them was absolute. He heard the patrol before he saw it. Or rather, he almost didn't hear it. That was the thing that stayed with Hoffmann long afterward. The detail he couldn't explain when he finally tried to write down what had happened. The patrol made almost no sound. There was a faint crunch of boots on frozen ground, the soft exhale of breath in cold air, the whisper of a jacket against bark. These were the sounds that any patrol made, sounds a trained soldier learned to filter for. What was missing was the sound that normally accompanied such movements, the distinct metallic voice of weapons. American weapons rattled. Their rifles clinked against equipment. Their Tommy guns, those heavy, solid machines built like something out of a factory that made furniture, made a particular sound when slung or handled, a dense, wooden steel knock that was unmistakable. Every German soldier in Europe knew what an American patrol sounded like, because American patrols announced themselves in the cold air. These men didn't. What Hoffmann's position held that night was a 4-man American scout patrol from the 2nd Battalion, 393rd Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division. They had moved 300 meters through a tree line that military doctrine considered impassable at night. Their sergeant was a man named Raymond Voss, 26 years old, from Dayton, Ohio, who had been working nights at a machine tool plant before the Army found him. He had large, careful hands and the specific patience of someone who spent years making precise things. He carried a weapon that his platoon leader had privately called an embarrassment to the American military-industrial complex. Voss called it his greaser, and he was very good with it. To understand why what happened next happened the way it did, it helps to understand what the greaser actually was, not what it looked like, and not what soldiers thought of when they first laid eyes on it, but what it was beneath the stamped metal and the crude welds. By 1942, the United States Army had a problem that was almost comically mundane given the scale of the war they were fighting. Their submachine gun, the Thompson, a weapon with a genuinely legendary combat reputation, was costing them an arm and a leg to produce. The original Thompson M1928A1 had run to something approaching $200 a unit in the late 1930s. Even the simplified wartime version, the M1A1, still demanded $45 and 150 man-hours of machining time for a single gun. Multiply that by the hundreds of thousands the Army needed, and you had a logistical headache of the first order. So in the fall of 1942, Colonel Rene Studler of the Ordnance Department's Small Arms Research Branch sat down with two men who understood both guns and factories. George Hyde, a firearms designer with a quiet, systematic approach to mechanical problems, and Frederick Sampson, the chief engineer of General Motors' Inland Division, a man who thought about manufacturing the way most people thought about breathing. Their assignment was simple and nearly impossible. Design a submachine gun that shoots the same .45 caliber ammunition as the Thompson, performs at least as well in combat, and costs a fraction of the price. They had 7 months. They succeeded. Hyde's weapon was an exercise in industrial thinking applied to violence. The receiver was 2 halves of stamped sheet steel, each pressed into shape and then welded together. The barrel required precision machining. The bolt required precision machining. Those were the 2 expensive parts, the 2 concessions to quality that the weapon couldn't avoid. Everything else, the wire stock that telescoped into itself, the trigger mechanism, the dust cover that doubled as the only safety the gun had, the housing that protected all of it, was stamped, pressed, spot welded, or cold formed from steel sheet that was 1/16 of an inch thick. The completed weapon had 73 parts. It weighed 8 pounds empty. It was 22 inches long with the wire stock folded, and just under 30 inches with it extended. At a cyclic rate of fire of 450 rounds per minute, it was one of the slowest automatic weapons in the Allied arsenal. Slower than the Thompson, dramatically slower than the German MP-40, slower than almost anything its users were likely to encounter, and its unit cost was $20. $20.94, to be precise, when production was running smoothly at the Guide Lamp Division in Anderson, Indiana, a factory that normally made automobile headlights and had recently finished assembling 1 million disposable pistols for resistance fighters in occupied Europe. They cranked out M3 as the same way Detroit made fenders. Quickly, efficiently, and in enormous numbers. The men at Guide Lamp were so confident in the throwaway philosophy behind Hyde's design that they didn't even plan to make replacement parts. The concept, delivered from on high at Army Ordnance, was explicitly this. When the gun broke, you discarded it and got a new one, like a light bulb. This was not a weapon built for a long relationship with its user. It was a weapon built for volume, for the arithmetic of industrial war, in which the ability to flood the battlefield with cheap firepower was more strategically valuable than providing every soldier with a beautiful, expensive machine. Sergeant Voss's greaser was not beautiful. It was approximately as aesthetically appealing as the pliers in a mechanic's toolbox, which was, in fact, how it had gotten its most famous name. A soldier who first saw the M3 in late 1943 looked at the mechanic's lubrication tool that every motor pool in the world kept hanging on a peg, and said the obvious thing. The name stuck. The grease gun, the plumber's nightmare, the cake decorator. There were other names, most of them anatomically specific, that soldiers used when they were certain their officers couldn't hear them. They did not say these things because the weapon had failed them. They said them because the weapon looked like it should fail them, and in the gap between appearance and reality, something interesting was happening. Sergeant Voss had first encountered the M3 at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, in the summer of 1944, during a training rotation that felt, by that point, almost surreal. Soldiers preparing for a war that had been going on for 3 years, learning to use a weapon that the Army couldn't fully explain to them with a straight face. The training sergeant who issued the grease guns to his section did so with the practiced neutrality of a man who had long since stopped forming opinions. The men held them, turned them over, looked at the welds. A private from Pittsburgh held us up by the wire stock, and it sagged slightly, the metal flexing in a way that solid steel shouldn't flex. Someone laughed. Someone else said it looked like a prop from a bad science fiction film. The training sergeant said nothing. Voss didn't laugh. He had spent 4 years at a machine tool plant running lathes and milling machines, and he understood what he was looking at. Not quality, exactly, but intention. Someone had made a series of very deliberate choices to build this thing, and those choices weren't random. The slow rate of fire. He felt it the first time he pulled the trigger, that measured, almost contemplative cadence. Barely more than 7 rounds per second wasn't a flaw. It was a decision. A faster rate of fire meant a harder to control weapon. Faster meant more ammunition burned, more recoil to fight, more muzzle climb to correct. 450 rounds per minute meant that a man who knew what he was doing could put a 3-round burst into a target at 30 meters with something close to mechanical precision. And then there was the cartridge. The .45 ACP, .45 automatic Colt pistol, had been around since 1904, when a man named John Browning designed it at the request of the U.S. Army following cavalry engagements in the Philippines where the standard .38 revolver round had proven lethally insufficient. The Army's new requirement was unambiguous. They needed a bullet that would stop a man, not wound him, not slow him down, stop him. The .45 ACP that resulted was a 230-grain projectile moving at roughly 850 to 900 feet per second, depending on the barrel length. A round that was, by the physics of such things, subsonic. It never broke the sound barrier. It was heavy. It was slow by rifle standards. And what it did at the moment of impact was transfer an enormous amount of kinetic energy into a very small volume of tissue. The Germans had their own submachine gun, the MP-40, a weapon that earned genuine respect from both the soldiers who carried it and the enemies who faced it. The MP-40 fired a 9mm parabellum round, lighter than the .45 ACP, faster, arriving with sharper, more penetrating impact. By certain technical measurements, the MP-40 was a superior weapon, better accuracy at range, higher velocity, magazine that fed more reliably in cold weather. But range was the operative word. At 50 meters, the ballistic advantage of the 9mm parabellum was real. At 30 meters, it was smaller. At 15 meters, in a doorway or around a corner, or in a trench or across a collapsed roof, the difference in terminal performance between a lighter, faster bullet and a heavier, slower one began to close with terrible speed. The greaser did not need range. The greaser was designed for the moment when range had already collapsed. Raymond Voss moved to the tree lane on the night of December 18, 1944, with the wire stock of his M3 pressed against his right forearm and his left hand supporting the magazine housing. The weapon pointed forward at a downward angle. The dust cover flipped open so that a pull of the trigger was all that stood between him and firing. Behind him, 3 other men from his squad moved in the same formation, spread far enough apart that a single burst of automatic fire couldn't hit more than one of them. The Ardennes that week was one of the more dangerous pieces of real estate in the Western world. 3 days earlier, on the 15th, the German army had launched its last great offensive in the west through these same forests. The operation that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, and the 99th Infantry Division had been among the American units caught in the initial onslaught, their lines hit by waves of infantry and armor that had materialized out of the fog and snow like something from a nightmare. The division had held mostly at enormous cost, and now the forest was a nightmare geography of uncertainty. American positions, German positions, and the dark matter between them where nobody was quite sure who held what. Voss's patrol had a simple mission. They were to determine whether a specific farm tract 300 meters northeast of the company perimeter was being used as a route for German supply movement. They were to observe, gather information, and return. They were explicitly not to engage unless engaged. He already knew that last part was optimistic. What he had in his favor, besides the 3 good men behind him, was temperature and darkness. It was 6 degrees Fahrenheit and overcast, the kind of cold that made sound carry differently, muffled in some directions, hyperclear in others, and the darkness under the trees was the darkness of a closed room. His men had taped everything that might rattle or reflect light. Their faces were darkened. And Voss's M3, despite its many shortcomings, had one quality that had begun to seem more important to him with each passing week. At 450 rounds per minute, firing a subsonic round from an 8-inch barrel, the thing was, by the standard of automatic weapons, quiet, not silent. Nothing with gunpowder in it is silent, but quiet, controllably, tactically quiet. The bark was short and low. The sonic signature, nothing like the sharp crack of a rifle or the sustained mechanical roar of a machine gun. In a forest, at night, in a firefight, that mattered. It mattered because the noise a weapon makes is information. Information about where you are, information about what you're carrying, information that an intelligent enemy uses to orient and respond. Voss had been in enough firefights to understand that the seconds between first contact and organized return fire were the most dangerous seconds in the world, and that anything which confused those seconds worked in his favor. Hoffman's position was 240 meters from a farm track, in a collapsed section of stone wall that had been part of a sheep enclosure before the war made it a fighting position. He had 2 men with him, a boy named Fisher who was 17 and shouldn't have been there, and a veteran corporal named Brandt who had been in the Wehrmacht since Poland in 1939, and who had developed the specific stillness of man who had outlived all his original assumptions about how long he would live. They heard the Americans at roughly 80 meters. Brandt put his hand on Hoffman's arm, gently, the way experienced soldiers communicate in the dark without sound, and pointed to the left. Hoffman could see nothing. He could hear almost nothing. Only that faint crunch, that breath of movement, that presence in the cold air that was a patrol coming through the trees at a diagonal to their position. He made the decision quickly, and later he would spend a long time wondering whether a different decision would have changed anything. The 3 Germans opened fire at roughly 60 meters, their weapons, 2 Carabiner 98K rifles and Brandt's MP40. Speaking into the darkness simultaneously, they were aiming at shadows and sound, the way you always were at night, and the initial fire was ragged and uncertain. The American patrol went aground. Then came a sound that Hoffman had never heard before, or rather, a sound he had not yet learned to fear. Low and measured, a slow mechanical hammering, almost like someone knocking on a wooden door at a very deliberate pace. 3 rounds. A pause. 3 more rounds. And then something hit Brandt, who was kneeling 2 meters to Hoffman's right, and Brandt said nothing and went sideways into snow and didn't move again. The sound continued. 3 rounds. A pause. 2 rounds. Not panicking, not spraying the darkness randomly the way frightened soldiers did, but working. Methodical, economical, targeted. Hoffman fired his rifle at the muzzle flash and heard the bolt click on an empty chamber and reached for another clip in the dark and felt Fisher stand up beside him. The boy, the 17-year-old boy who was going to stand up in a firefight because nobody had taught him properly not to, and then Fisher was down too, and Hoffman was alone, and the slow mechanical knocking was still going on somewhere in the darkness to his left. He ran. He ran for 50 meters through the trees, until he hit a frozen ditch and fell into it, and lay there with his cheek against the ice, listening to the forest settle back into silence. The sound had stopped. There were no pursuing footsteps. After 10 minutes, there was nothing at all except the wind. He survived the night and the winter and the war, and he came home to Stuttgart in 1946 and worked for 30 years in an automotive parts warehouse and never talked about what he'd seen unless someone specifically asked. But what he remembered most clearly from the Ardennes was not the cold, and not the artillery, and not the sight of Brandt going sideways into the snow. It was that sound, slow, patient, utterly certain of itself, like something knocking at a door it knew would eventually open. Sergeant Voss brought his patrol back to the perimeter at 0310 hours with the information his company commander needed about the farm track. It was indeed being used for German movement, and one member of the squad who had taken a rifle round to meet his left shoulder and was swearing with a steady, focused creativity that Voss found almost comforting. Nobody had died. The German position had been neutralized. The mission was complete. His company commander, a captain named Elias Thorne who had played tackle for Michigan State and thought in football terms even when discussing military operations, looked at the M3 hanging from Voss's right hand and made a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a laugh. "You actually trust that thing," Thorne said. It wasn't quite a question. Voss looked at the weapon. In the lamplighted command post, it looked exactly like what it was. $20 worth of stamped steel and spot welds, graceless and utilitarian and thoroughly ordinary. The wire stock was slightly bent where he jammed it against a tree trunk during the contact. There was blood on the magazine housing, not his, that he would have to clean off before inspection. Patrolling weapon, he said. Put 1 in, 2 in, 3 in, whatever you need. Doesn't rattle. Doesn't climb on you. 45 hits them like they walked into a wall. Thorne said nothing for a moment. He had a Thompson leaning against a wall behind his desk. A beautiful weapon, heavy and purposeful, with a wooden stock and a drum magazine that held 50 rounds and the kind of presence that made men straighten up slightly when they saw it. The Tommy gun looked like a weapon. The M3 looked like something you'd find behind a gas station. The boys in the 393rd keep asking for Thompsons, Thorne said. Regimental keeps telling them the M3 is just as good. Regimental isn't doing night patrols at -6, Voss said. He cleaned the weapon that night, taking it down into its component pieces in a way that had become automatic, the barrel unscrewing from its housing, the bolt sliding free, the trigger group, the wire stock that doubled as a cleaning rod if you threaded a patch through the right end. 73 parts. In good light, it took less than a minute to field strip. In the dark, with cold hands, maybe 3 minutes. That was a design feature too, though nobody in a training manual ever said it quite so directly. A weapon that a man can clean and reassemble with numb fingers in a cold barn at 3 in the morning is a weapon a man will actually maintain. A weapon a man maintains is a weapon that works when he needs it. He oiled the bolt and the guide rods, wiped down the magazine, loaded it back to 30 rounds, and sat on the ground beside his sleeping position with the dust cover closed. $20. He thought about that sometimes. The boots on his feet had cost the government more. What Voss understood instinctively, and what Army ordnance understood intellectually, but had trouble communicating to soldiers who formed their opinions about weapons with their eyes rather than their brains, was that the M3 was designed for a very specific set of conditions. And those conditions, by some combination of strategic reality and operational necessity, were exactly the conditions that defined the final year of the war in Europe. By late 1944, the fighting in the Western Theater had moved off the open ground where range and firepower advantage mattered most. The Wehrmacht, in retreat, was fighting from fixed positions. Towns, cities, farmhouses, tree lines, hedgerows, rivers. The Americans advancing into Germany were moving through Aachen, through the Ardennes Forest, through the snow and villages of the Ardennes, through the wreckage of the Rhineland. These were not environments for long-range rifle fire. These were environments for the 30-meter problem, for the moment when a hallway ended and a doorway began, when a corner in a ruined street became the only geography that mattered. In those conditions, the MP-40 that German soldiers carried was genuinely excellent. It was light, accurate, and fired a reliable cartridge with manageable muzzle flash. But it fired 9mm parabellum rounds. And at 30 meters, the difference of what a 9mm round does to a human being versus what a .45 ACP round does to a human being is not trivial. The .45 ACP carries approximately twice the sectional density of the 9mm bullet at comparable velocities. It doesn't travel faster. In fact, it travels slower, but the energy it deposits in tissue is catastrophic in a way that the smaller, faster round, paradoxically, is not. American tankers understood this by intuition. The M3 had been designated as a personal defense weapon for armored vehicle crews from the beginning of its service life. And for good reason. A tank crew that had to bail out of a burning Sherman was not a fighting unit in any tactical sense. They were frightened men in a very small space, climbing out a steel coffin into whatever waited outside. What waited outside was often Wehrmacht infantry at point-blank range. The M3, stored inside the turret where a Thompson would have been too long and too heavy, was there for exactly those 30 seconds, the time between the crew escaping the vehicle and either reaching cover or dying in the attempt. Late-model Sherman tanks carried as many as 5 of them. An armorer named Russell Spooner described it precisely. An M3 lifted above a hatch and fired in a sweeping arc could put an enormous volume of .45 caliber rounds into the immediate area of the tank in a matter of seconds. Against infantry attempting to approach a burning vehicle, that was usually sufficient. The men of Patton's armored columns moving through France and Belgium in the autumn of 1944 had a phrase for what the grease gun did in those close moments that actual battle produced. They called it convincing. The Thompson was a convincing weapon. The M3 was also convincing. They said, just cheaper about it. There was another version of the M3 that very few people knew about in 1944, and that even fewer would know about for decades afterward. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, predecessor to what would eventually become the CIA, had identified a problem early in the war. Their agents and the resistance fighters they supported operated in conditions where a conventional firearm was worse than useless. Cities under German occupation, where a single gunshot in the wrong street at the wrong hour could bring a Gestapo response within minutes and end an entire network. What they needed was a weapon that could kill quietly enough that a body could be found without a firefight having been announced. They came to the Army with that requirement, and the Army took the M3 to Bell Laboratories. The Bell Labs engineers, men who normally thought about telephone systems and signal propagation and the precise behavior of electromagnetic waves, looked at Hyde's design and saw something useful. The .45 ACP round was already subsonic. It never broke the sound barrier, which meant that the crack of supersonic passage, the loudest component of most gunshot sounds, was absent. The only noise remaining was the mechanical sound of the weapon cycling and the report of propellant gases escaping the barrel. Both of those problems were solvable. They designed a suppressor around the M3's barrel, a specially drilled tube with internal baffles that allowed the propellant gases to expand and cool before escaping, dramatically reducing the acoustic signature of each shot. The result, assembled with care in a limited production run of approximately 1,000 units, was a weapon that fired a .45 caliber bullet capable of dropping a man at 25 meters with a sound that a witness on the other side of a closed door might describe later as someone knocking. OSS teams took suppressed M3S into occupied France, Belgium, Norway, and the Far East. In Normandy, before and after the D-Day landings, OSS operatives used them to remove sentries from specific positions without alerting adjacent posts. In the Pacific, similar work was done against Japanese command infrastructure. The details of these operations remained classified for years, and most of the men who carried those weapons never discussed them publicly, what the Germans knew or suspected or feared, because information travels in war, even across enemy lines, even in fragments and rumors, was that the Americans had a submachine gun that was sometimes nearly silent, that you could be standing 30 feet from a man who was using one and not know, in the dark, which direction the shots were coming from, that the sound it made, the slow, deliberate knock of heavy bullets, told you nothing useful about range or position. That was a different kind of fear than the fear of heavy artillery or dive bombers. It was personal and intimate and had no rational military response. The M3 arrived in the Pacific too, though in smaller numbers and with less fanfare. Marine Corps tankers on Iwo Jima carried them in their Shermans the way their counterparts in Europe did, for the same brutal reasons. Navy vessels kept them in small arms lockers for shore parties. OSS-led guerrilla units in Burma and the Philippines found them useful for the same reasons the resistance networks in France had. Compact, controllable, and operating a cartridge that required no external sonic assistance to be quiet enough for the work. The soldiers in the Pacific who encountered the M3 had broadly the same initial reaction as everyone else. It looked wrong. It looked insubstantial. It looked like something built in a hurry by people who didn't care whether it survived. A Marine sergeant on Okinawa reportedly looked at his first M3, looked at the Thompson it was replacing, and said, with the specific disappointment of a man who had been handed a tuna salad sandwich when he expected steak, "This is what we're fighting the war with now." He used it anyway. He used it because it was there, and because it worked, and because the Thompson's beautiful wooden stock shattered when you needed to use it as a club, and the M3's wire stock just bent slightly and kept functioning. He used it because it fit in the cramped interior of a tank turret when the Thompson didn't. He used it because when a Japanese soldier came at him at 5 meters through jungle undergrowth, range and accuracy were mathematical abstractions, and stopping power was the only thing that mattered. The grease gun's ugliest chapter came not on the battlefield, but in the logistics chain that was supposed to support it. The Army's original vision, that the M3 would be disposable, replaced rather than repaired when it broke, encountered immediate, predictable, catastrophic reality the moment combat began. A soldier deep inside enemy territory, whose M3 had developed a fault in its cocking mechanism when the thin metal of the retracting handle sheared off from a hard impact, did not have access to a supply depot where he could exchange his broken weapon for a new one. He had a useless piece of metal and an enemy patrol somewhere behind him and very limited options. This happened regularly. The fragile cocking lever, 9 separate parts pressed together from thin-gauge steel, was the M3's most persistent enemy in the field. Drop the weapon the wrong way on a hard surface, and the handle could shear cleanly off, leaving the bolt locked forward and the weapon permanently inoperative. Repair depots across Europe ran constant streams of damaged M3S through improvised modification programs, fitting them with more robust cocking knobs cobbled together from whatever materials were available. The Army's response was the M3A1, standardized in December 1944, the same month that the German offensive in the Ardennes began. The improvement was elegant in its simplicity. The entire cocking lever assembly was eliminated. In its place, a deep cylindrical slot was machined into the bolt itself. To charge the weapon, you inserted a finger into that slot and pulled the bolt rearward until it locked. 1 part instead of 9. Nothing to shear, nothing to misalign, nothing to break. The rest of the improvements were similar in philosophy. A magazine loading tool welded to the wire stock, a stronger rear sight, a redesigned dust cover that reduced the tendency toward accidental discharge if the weapon was dropped. The M3A1 was, in almost every technical sense, the weapon the M3 should have been from the beginning. The men who used it in the last months of the war and the Korean War that came 5 years later experienced fewer failures and held it in something closer to genuine affection. The insult still came, because soldiers insult their weapons the way sailors insult their ships, with the particular familiarity of an unhappy relationship that everyone involved knows will continue indefinitely. Staff Sergeant J.W. Logan, serving with the 101st Infantry Regiment in late 1944, recommended formally that machine gun squad leaders carry the M3 as a matter of doctrine. Unit after unit in the 99th Infantry Division sent back evaluations that used the same language. Best weapon for patrolling, best weapon for the close work, accurate and powerful at short ranges, quick to get into action from the carry position. The men who had called it junk in training had, by the German border, mostly stopped calling it anything at all. It had passed the only test that matters. Technical Sergeant Charles F. Carey of the 397th Infantry Regiment, 100th Infantry Division, carried an M3 on the morning of January 8, 1945, at a small town called Rimling in eastern France, when his platoon found itself pinned down by a German position that had no intention of yielding. What Carey did that morning, moving forward alone, working around the German flank, appearing in a position that made clear to 30 or 40 enemy soldiers that their situation was no longer viable, and persuading them to surrender with nothing but nerve in the presence of his weapon, earned him the Medal of Honor. The citation doesn't make much of the specific weapon he carried. Citations rarely do. But Carey was armed with an M3, and the mathematics of the moment were what they were. One man with a .45 caliber submachine gun, alone, in a position from which he could engage 30 or 40 soldiers before any of them could reach him. The greaser held 30 rounds in its magazine and fired 7.5 of them per second. At 15 meters, which was approximately the engagement range of the moment, a .45 ACP round fired from an M3 was not a suggestion. It was a conclusion. Carey later traded his M3 for a bazooka and an M1 rifle, and spent the rest of that day disabling a German tank before shooting its crew individually as they tried to escape. That was the kind of day it was. But it started with the greaser. The war ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender, and the Army, perhaps embarrassed by how much it had come to rely on a weapon it had initially designated as disposable, quietly adjusted its relationship with the M3 in the years that followed. The weapon remained in service, with tankers, with special operations units, with every category of soldier who needed something compact and powerful and completely unconcerned with its own appearance. In Korea, the M3 became the primary American submachine gun on the peninsula, partly because the Chinese forces that crossed the Yalu River in 1950 were carrying Thompsons. Lend-Lease weapons originally provided to the Chinese nationalists, now in the hands of communist forces. And issuing Thompsons to both sides of the same conflict created a logistical and tactical identification problem that the Army chose to solve by issuing M3s instead. The Ithaca Gun Company built another 33,000 M3A1s during the Korean War. More were rebuilt from existing stock. The weapon that was supposed to last until it broke, and then be thrown away, was outlasting the manufacturers who had built it. In Vietnam, suppressed versions reappeared, fitted with the removable Bell Laboratories pattern barrels that allowed a standard M3A1 to be converted to a suppressed configuration in the field. Special Forces teams and CIA paramilitary units used them in the same dark work for which the OSS had originally designed them, in the same jungle conditions, for the same reasons. The weapon that was a throwaway in 1942 was classified equipment in 1968, locked in Special Operations arms rooms. In 1977, When Charles Beckwith stood up Delta Force in the ruins of an abandoned building at Fort Bragg and looked at the weapons available to equip his new counterterrorism unit. One of the things he chose was a suppressed M3A1. Eric Haney, one of Delta Force's earliest operators, wrote about it later. The quiet, reliable performance of the suppressed greaser in a role that no one in 1942 could have possibly imagined it filling. Hostage rescue, counterterrorism, the close and careful violence of professional operators in hallways and stairwells and small rooms. Delta Force eventually moved to the Heckler and Koch MP5 because the Germans had built something that fit the role more precisely. But they kept the M3A1S for a while longer because some of the operators felt, quietly and without wanting to seem sentimental about a piece of stamped metal, that the suppressed performance of the old greaser was better than anything newer they'd been offered. In the Gulf War in 1991, M3A1S were still being issued to armored vehicle crews as backup weapons aboard M60 tanks. Soldiers who had been born after the Korean War were being equipped with a weapon designed to be thrown away during World War II. Some of the units that carried them into Kuwait were National Guard formations equipped with tanks that would themselves be retired within a decade. The gun survived both. There are M3S still in service somewhere in the world right now with the Philippine Navy, which refurbished them with integral suppressors and Picatinny rails, with various militaries across Southeast Asia and Latin America that never had the budget or the reason to replace something that still worked. In Afghanistan, a few turned up in a hand to people who couldn't have told you what year they were made or who George Hyde was. They were just guns that fired a large bullet reliably at short range and didn't ask much in return. Klaus Dieter Hoffmann, if he is still alive, would be in his early hundreds. He left no published memoir and gave no recorded interviews. What happened in the Ardennes in December 1944 happened to millions of people simultaneously, and most of the men who were there on all sides, German, American, British, Belgian, are gone now, their memories gone with them. What remains is a record. The after-action reports, the unit histories, the evaluations filed by small unit leaders who tried, in Army bureaucratic language, to describe what they had learned about a weapon their Army had initially designed to be disposable. The language in those reports is careful and factual and not given to drama. Best weapon for patrolling. Quick to action. Accurate and powerful at short range. The men who wrote those words have been doing night patrols in the Ardennes in winter and fighting house to house through German cities and extracting themselves from burning tanks. And they had learned, in the most direct possible way, the difference between how something looks and what it does. The German soldiers who encountered the M3 in the dark, in the triolines and villages and ruined streets where the war ended, knew only what they experienced. A sound unlike anything they'd been trained to recognize. A cadence that was slow and deliberate and utterly unlike panic. A bullet that arrived like a closed fist and did not negotiate. They named their fear with a precision that soldiers apply to the things that actually kill them. Not the impressive weapons, not the famous ones, not the things that announce themselves with thunderclap and spectacle. The things that work quietly, efficiently, and without any apparent need for admiration. George Hyde's $20 machine, a plumber's nightmare, an embarrassment to the military-industrial complex, a piece of junk built to be thrown away. It is still out there somewhere, still working, still doing what it was designed to do, in whatever dark and close and desperate place it finds itself, exactly as it did in the winter of 1944, when a sergeant from Dayton, Ohio, pressed his wire stock against his forearm, flipped open a dust cover that also served as a safety, and moved through a frozen forest with the specific patience of man who had no need to look impressive and every need to come home. You almost never remember the weapons that helped you do that. The ones you remember are the beautiful ones, the famous ones, the ones the movies chose. The ones that did the actual work in the actual dark are usually already on their way to the trash by the time anyone thinks to write them down. This one almost made it there. Almost. What other weapons of World War II did history almost forget? Weapons that worked too quietly, cost too little, and mattered too much. Tell us in the comments. Subscribe, and we'll keep pulling these stories out of the dark before they disappear entirely.